This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Thanks for joining the Carbon Farming Podcast. My name is Scott Warr, and today we're going to talk about some legislation. In 2020, the European Commission approved the European Green Deal. If you're not aware of what that is, it's an ambitious set of policy initiatives with the goal of making the European Union climate neutral by the year 2050. Now, to do this, it was understood that the EU economy needed to be transformed as well. Since then, a series of further policies have been signed that put this plan into action. Today, we're talking with Christopher Chapman of Agoro Carbon Alliance about one of the more recent policies to be signed, the Carbon Renewal Certification Framework. This framework aims to incentivize activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere, thereby generating credits that can be sold to countries or companies. Various activities may generate carbon removal credits, but our interest today will be about the prospect of European farmers generating credits through these regenerative practices. Christopher, thank you for joining us. Tell us give us a little bit of context here. Why is this potentially a really big deal for us?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, well, this is a big deal because it's essentially going to transform the European economy. And in doing so, it's going to create a lot of penalties or caps for emitting. But more importantly, there's going to be a lot of incentives in demand for activities that will reduce or remove emissions from the atmosphere. And so, additionally, this is a big deal because this is the first time that actually removals, not just emission reductions, have been incorporated into some sort of large-scale regulatory scheme. So previously, you had the Kyoto Protocol and other sorts of operations that were aimed at reducing emissions. And the idea of removing emissions had always been toyed around with, but no one really thought that it could be done in a legitimate way. And so it had always kind of stayed by the wayside. Now it's finally come to the forefront in at least some sort of major way in the European Union. And so this will have a potentially very large impact on nature-based carbon offset markets, given the fact that a lot of these removals will be from nature-based solutions, which will both incentivize further action as well as create more demand for these types of activities.
Excellent. Now, Christopher comes with this with a lot of experience. Over the past 7 years, he's worked to ensure that the private sector funding for climate change mitigation is directed to credible activities that contribute to sustainable development. He has a BS in economics and a master's in conservation biology and sustainable development. He's been developing a strategy to utilize Agoro Carbon's expertise in facilitating agricultural emission reductions and removals to lower Scope 3 emissions. Before he joined Agoro Carbon, Christopher worked for a voluntary carbon market standards organization managing 2 sustainable development focused standards. So he has a little bit of background, and as we listen to some of these new policies and why they're important and how they affect the agricultural market and how they affect you and I that are listening to this podcast, he comes with some credibility. Christopher, what activities would you consider, or what would be included in the removal framework?
Sure. So there's right now laid out 4 broad categories of activities that are included. The first is going to be permanent carbon removals. So this is going to be more of a technological solution with direct air capture or capturing from point of source, so smokestacks, that type of thing, and then having that carbon dioxide or other emissions stored directly in the ground or other types of materials for centuries. So that's the first type. The second is going to be some sort of temporary carbon storage in long-lasting products, such as like wood-based construction. So we know that when you use wood, that wood captured the CO2 from the air in the first place, and then you're using that, and it could be in a home or some other structure for 100, 200 years. So that's some sort of temporary storage. The third type of category of activity will be temporary carbon storage from carbon farming, which is a little misleading given what we're about to talk about, because it's carbon farming in the idea that you're restoring forest and or wetlands or other types of ecosystems that draw up the carbon, not traditional farming. And then the last one is the more traditional farming activity, which we think of, which is soil emission reductions from carbon farming. So that's going to include carbon and nitrous oxide reductions from soil management and activities that overall reduce or remove carbon emissions from the atmosphere and store them into the soil in some sort of biological matter. So that's going to be what we're normally used to thinking about when we're talking about regenerative agricultural practices. So no-till, reduced use of fertilizer, the use of cover crops, as well as other activities such as like wetland management.
As you talk about these four pillars or ways that we can remove carbon, where do you see is the biggest potential? Where's the biggest opportunity among those four?
Well, it's really going to be depending on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to people in the technological space, they're going to be most interested in the permanent carbon removals because they want to develop those solutions, and industry itself is going to be most interested in that because they want to be able to reduce their own footprints through the development of these technologies. And then if you're talking about like food companies or farmers themselves, they're clearly going to be most interested in this soil emission reduction. And that's what we're most interested in because we think this is a huge game changer for the European economy because of the noun of farmers. This would impact in the matter of food companies. This could potentially impact, as well as the overall reductions that would be generated from these activities.
So once we've identified these, now I think that we need to understand what kind of requirements would be put in place to generate the credits. Where are we with that? What kinds of requirements are put in place?
Yeah, so there's four main, four again, four seems to be the magic number for all of these. Four main pillars for the actual removal framework. That's going to be quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. I'll kind of talk about each one of those. So first, for quantification, uh, the requirement is that in order to actually quantify the emission reductions and removals that these projects will generate, they will have to be done so with an EU approved methodology or protocol to ensure that the interventions, the monitoring, and the calculations are using all of the best available science. It's not quite clear right now as to whether or not, well, the indications have been given that they are going to develop their own methodologies,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not quite clear as to whether or not there might be some sort of flexibility with using existing methodologies that can be approved in the carbon removal framework or something along those lines. Next is additionality. So this is still something that needs to be demonstrated because you still have to demonstrate that the actions taken are actually an improvement to what had been already existing. But if you're familiar with the additionality thresholds that are for the voluntary carbon market right now, this will be much more streamlined because they're going to be using the idea of a standardized baseline. So part of those quantification methodologies, the idea is that they will create standardized baselines, which basically says in a given area, here's what the average emissions coming off a particular crop will be in a given year. That's the baseline. And as part of that, there's then the next step, which is a performance threshold. So they will create or a performance benchmark. So that benchmark will either be exactly the same as that standardized baseline, or it might be a little bit lower than that standardized baseline. And what happens is if a farmer can then demonstrate that they've reduced their emissions below that performance threshold or that performance benchmark, which is either the same or below the baseline, they've demonstrated that they've taken additional actions that the average grower has not taken, and therefore that's how they're demonstrating automatically that they are additional. So they've taken additional steps, or they've taken additional action that would not have been taken place in the baseline scenario.
Got it.
So after additionality, there's long-term storage, because we can do all of this work to try to store as much carbon in the soil as possible. But if policies change or something else happens and that farmer wants to end up plowing it all right back into the atmosphere again, or allowing it to be released back in the atmosphere again, it's not really doing much overall climate benefit. So they have to stick around for a while. So there's two real key aspects that are laid out right now. As to how exactly these will be done, we'll have to wait and see based on the quantification or the methodologies that will be developed. But the first is monitoring. So there will have to be continuous ongoing monitoring to ensure that the practices that have led to the removals don't change.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part will be some sort of liability system. And this essentially is, if there is some sort of accident, or there is some sort of change, what will ensure that those credits that were already produced still have value? So if you're familiar with the voluntary carbon market, specifically Verra's VM42 methodology, you'll know that there is a buffer account that all projects have to deposit into. They haven't said specifically that it would operate the same way as Verra's pooled buffer account, but the language kind of indicates that something similar would have to be developed for this certification framework, in which projects would develop a certain percentage of their emission reductions removals into some sort of an account that can be drawn upon if there is some sort of accidental reversal of those sequestered emissions.
Interesting.
And then lastly, there's this sustainability pillar, which basically just says that the EU has already set these sustainability objectives, and the project activities cannot harm those sustainability objectives, and must contribute positively to at least one of them.
Interesting. So we have this new legislation, we have these new requirements. Let's bring this back to, what does it mean on farm? What does a farmer need to do to create these credits?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this is not going to be a situation where just one person or one farmer can go out and do this. This is going to require a whole team of people,
Mm-hmm.
and different entities fulfilling different roles. So it really comes down to having the actual project. Then you will need a certifier and a verifier. So the projects themselves can be the farmers, or farmers in conjunction with a project developer such as Agoro Carbon Alliance or some of the other ones out there. So they're the ones who are actually doing the work on the ground, generating those emission reductions and removals. And then the certifiers are the organizations that actually say, yes, you have generated emission reductions and or removals, and we're going to issue those credits. So if you're using the analogy of the voluntary carbon market, that's going to be the standards organizations like Gold Standard or Verra. And then lastly, there's going to be the verifiers or auditors, and that's going to be just like the voluntary carbon market, where there will be independent third-party auditors who are trained or qualified in some sort of way to assess as to whether or not the emission reductions or removals have actually been generated and are sequestered appropriately. As to who will be fulfilling all these roles, it's not quite clear. The biggest question right now will be, who will be these certifiers?
Mm-hmm.
They've given no indication that they're going to set up some sort of central authority within the EU that will be the certification organization, but have given more of an indication that they will allow various organizations, not quite clear if it's private or public, to fulfill that role of that certifier, assuming that they can demonstrate they have the capacity and the qualifications for doing so.
You know, it sounds like it can be very complicated or difficult to do this whole process if you're a farmer. I mean, you got into farming because you like to grow things, right? And it seems like you need a team or an organization around you that can help you understand the requirements, put into place the measurements and the checks and balances that you need to capitalize on these. I'm just curious, who's buying these credits? So the credits get generated by all these four different ways that you can generate credits. Who's actually buying the credits?
Yeah. So the whole purpose of this is to transform the economy. And so it kind of rests on two different major buyers of these credits, which are going to be the EU countries themselves
Mm-hmm.
and regulated industry, because those are going to be the two entities that are going to have some sort of requirements that they've reduced their emissions by X amount by 2050. And if they don't, these credits are a way for them to fill any gaps in their commitments. So we know that countries and regulated industries will be the main buyers, but outside of that, there's been some gray area left in the legislation thus far that kind of indicates that other entities may be able to purchase these, and they're using a mechanism called a contribution unit. So instead of it being called a carbon offset, this gets a little bit too technical. I don't know whether or not it's worth going into here, but the idea being that in order to avoid double counting, they want to allow private industry to contribute to an individual country's reductions or removals,
Ah,
uh, but still have those reductions or removals stay with that country. So it's essentially a way for a company to be able to say, "Hey, we want to help contribute, but we know that we can't actually own these, but so we'll buy a contribution unit and pay for these activities in country X or country Y."
no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So as I'm thinking about this legislation becoming the EU becoming climate neutral by 2050, that's 26 years from now. Are there intermediate goals and that where we can get more clarification on these requirements and measurements?
Hopefully. I mean, what I would say is that since 2020, further clarifications have slowly been rolling out, and
Okay.
even some of the requirements tightening up and becoming much more specific, which is great. Um, but at the same time, it it's not quite clear as to how long it'll take before this is all operationalized. Um, so realistically, it's not going to be closer until 2030 that I would actually anticipate actually any kind of credits being issued or sold or anything along those lines. And then you also have to take into account that political changes do occur, and we actually just saw some of that with the recent European Union elections, where the political climate shifted a little bit. So it's not going to completely derail the EU Green Deal, but it might just shift their priorities or slow things down a little bit. So, but that's all hard to say right now.
Ashley and Christopher, I'm going to ask a question here. It may not be fair, so I'm going to ask it, and you can tell me whether it's fair or not. Prior to this EU Green Deal, were they participating in the carbon marketplace? Were farmers sequestering carbon and getting credits, getting paid for those credits prior to this?
No, not in the EU. Well, not in a regular. So, like, this is a quasi-regulated space.
Got it.
This Green Deal, meaning that because there's requirements to reduce the emissions, and because carbon farming has been identified as a way to offset that liability in some sort of way, so it's quasi regulatory. Um, but until this, there has not been anything specifically around agriculture. The
Okay.
European Union had the European Trading Scheme, the ETS, but that was for very specific carbon intensive industries, and they could not purchase credits from any kind of agriculture or even any kind of nature based solutions. There were starting to be voluntary carbon projects that were popping up in the European Union, but this would be the first kind of more regulated approach.
So with this new European Green Deal, what does this mean for Agoro?
It means that Agoro Carbon Alliance could be entering the European Union space. We have the experience to be able to actually operate within this framework. As you said before, a lot of growers would likely need some sort of helping hand to be able to walk through all of these regulatory and certification pieces. It's the same basic framework as a voluntary carbon market space, and so therefore our experience would very easily translate well to this space to allow farmers to capitalize on this increased revenue that could be coming to them through this deal. But we will still have to see how the finalized rules and regulations come out. It may make it easier for organizations like Agoro Carbon Alliance to operate in this space, but if private sectors are completely cut out in some sort of capacity, then obviously we can't. But even outside of us operating projects in the EU, it leads greater legitimacy and recognition of these regenerative agricultural practices. Given the fact that, as I said before, this is a quasi-regulatory scheme, it adds a lot more credibility to these practices and can demonstrate that they can be done with a lot more credibility than some people may have already thought.
Interesting. Okay, Christopher, I want you to reach into your briefcase and pull out your crystal ball and tell us how this Green Deal is going to influence or motivate other countries, maybe even the United States, North America, or other countries around the world. Are they going to see this as a test pilot and try to mirror that? And do you see other countries following?
I would love to say so. With anything related to climate mitigation or climate resiliency, I would love to say so. But it really comes down to the economic incentives. And I think this has the potential of producing those economic incentives for those transitions. So yes, there's a big maybe on that one. Yeah. I mean, there's two real ways that it would lead to changes outside the European Union. One would be essentially tariffs on carbon coming into the European Union, which is not outlandish given the fact that they have these strong deforestation commitments that they've put in place this year. So if they were to essentially further evolve the European Green Deal and say there's going to be a carbon tax associated with goods coming into the European Union, that could very quickly transform economies outside. Additionally, it's the carrot on the side of things. If all of this money is being poured into these programs and more technologies and more experience is being demonstrated that these techniques really do work and incentivize others outside, that's another way that you could see shifts from outside the European Union. That's the more positive and more realistic one, but that one's going to be a little bit slower. As to whether or not a carbon tariff would be imposed, who knows? I doubt. I wouldn't want to make that prediction now, but that would be a very decisive action.
Well, Christopher, thanks for coming on and teaching us a little bit more about this European Green Deal that was started back in 2020 and continues to roll out these economic transformations and the requirements that are going to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. Hopefully we can keep a sharp eye on them and learn something from them and continue to help farmers be profitable and sustainable so that they can do what they're good at. And that's growing crops and fiber and cattle and livestock so that we can feed the world. So thank you very much, Christopher.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.